Well, finally here. It's so exciting. Thank you for joining me.
Happy to do it, Claire. Thanks so much for having me out.
Okay, so your family made the move from the south to the north.
Yes.
What drew you and your family to Dayton at that time, and what made you stay?
Well, my dad was in the newspaper business, so he ran small papers in Alabama up until that point, and he got a chance to come up to the Dayton area to be publisher of the Centerville, Bellbrook, Kettering, Oakwood Times, which is a twice-weekly paper, suburban paper. And so that was 1978. I just finished my freshman year of high school in Haleyville, Alabama. And we'd moved around to different towns. I was born in Gadsden, lived in Troy in South Alabama for about 4 years from when I was like 6 to 10, and then Haleyville, and then moved up here. So I started sophomore year at Centerville High School and graduated from there and started going to Wright State the following fall. And my parents ended up moving to Virginia. My dad went to work on another paper there in Virginia, in Petersburg, Virginia. And I was in school, so I stayed here, and I've been here ever since. I did spend about 8 months in Virginia, had some car problems, dropped out of school for a little bit, stayed with my parents for 8 months, worked at JCPenney's, sold shoes. Came back, went to Wright State, finished up, and I've been here ever since. Yeah, I mean, it was a big move, living in small town Alabama to come into a place like Dayton where there's a couple universities, there's major factories and businesses, there's a lot going on. So it was already, a big change of pace for me. And even living in Alabama, unbeknownst to me, I was already a fan of some of the things that were happening here. Ohio Players, Heat Wave. I was already listening to that music, buying the 45s. I wasn't quite buying the albums yet, but did have, Heat Wave Boogie Nights and stuff like that on 45 before we'd made the move up here. And at the time, at 15, when all your friends are who you know in Alabama, I didn't want to move up here. I would have been happy to stay down there. And one of the carrots my dad threw out at me was, the guys from Ohio Players and Heat Wave are from Dayton. And I was like, oh, that's something, because I was always a music fanatic from the going back. And, I'd known Ohio Players since I was about 10 years old. My Uncle Varney used to make mixtapes. He was one of my dad's older brothers. He had 6 brothers. And Varney would make mixtapes on 8-track tapes. And we would take a lot of road trips, and my dad would play these tapes. And one of them, I remember, I was about 10 years old, but in 1973 was Funky Worm. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know who the Ohio Players was at the time. But it's this crazy kind of novelty song, but funny. It sounds like it could be risque, but it's really not. It's just about a worm who comes out of the ground and plays a funky tune. And this grandma character who wants to be his manager. So it's just like a funny tune, and I just remembered that. And it was on this crazy tape that had like Allman Brothers and other stuff. My Uncle Varney was a pretty hip guy. He later on owned a video store, one of the first guys in his area to own a store where they sold and rented VHS tapes in Gadsden, Alabama. I guess I was already primed for some of this funk stuff, even though I really didn't know it at the time. And at the time, like, even the word funk wasn't as well known. It was basically everybody would just thought of it as R&B, really. It was funk, but it was just all part of that umbrella of R&B music. And so you would think that Alabama would be, kind of closed-minded and things like that. But, my dad I grew up listening to, Johnny Cash, Ray Charles, Otis Redding, CCR, Creedence Clearwater Revival, the Beach Boys, the Beatles. He liked all that stuff. So it was, I was lucky to have that experience. And I don't know if he got that from his brother or where that came from or where they got that. But I was lucky enough to get kind of a broad musical education as a kid, because none of my parents were musicians or anything like that, just big music fans. And I still have all those records that they had back in the day. So, yeah. So that brought me to Dayton. And, like I said, I've been here since.
That reminds me, like, what features made Dayton a more desirable place to live comparatively to other cities in the Midwest?
Well, I mean, there were a lot of attractions, and it wasn't just Dayton. There was Akron, there was Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, even like Hamilton and Middletown were drawing people up from the South to take these jobs, factory jobs, whether it was Frigidaire, GM, some of these bigger companies, or smaller companies. Manufacturing was booming around here, so people were coming up and able to take these jobs, and they were bringing with them their culture, their music, their food, their fashion, all this stuff. And it was blacks and whites. So you had, black folks coming from the South. They were bringing blues, R&B, gospel, some folk, and likewise, some of the white folks were bringing in folk music, bluegrass, country, other roots music, and all that stuff was coming to the area. These people were working together. They were, side by side sometimes, sharing this stuff. And so it all starts to blend together. Not to mention, there's universities here, which I mentioned before. And so people had a chance to not only get a job here, but they knew that their kids could possibly get an education in the same town where they were living. And there weren't always the opportunities in those days to send your kids out of state for college, unless you were really well off. It was more realistic that they would go to Ohio State or go to school in Cincinnati or Dayton or something like that. So there was a lot of things to, cost of living wasn't too bad here. And compared to Chicago, New York, Detroit, not quite as cold. The weather's a little bit nicer. And when you're here, too, you could jump on 75, and it's easy to get back down south to see the family. And I know from moving from Alabama to here that we made that trek down 75 through Chattanooga and then down into Alabama countless times for the holidays and back, And so it brings this corridor that's just constantly sharing culture, sharing music, and it just builds this cycle that goes back and forth and feeds each other, and it kind of made this place kind of a nice kind of ground zero to be able to fertilize some of this stuff. Because parents had jobs, they could get instruments for their kids. They could rent a saxophone or buy a saxophone if their kid wanted to take part in that school, or a violin or a guitar or bass. And so there was some disposable income too that helped build this kind of fostering middle class that helps foster this whole growth of music, from bluegrass to rock to R&B and funk, jazz as well, So it was just kind of like a perfect storm at the right time in the, mid part of the 20th century. The 20th century to do that, I guess, or toward the end of the 20th century. But yeah, no, I guess it would have been the mid, right? So it would have been the 40s, 50s, 60s when people were making this. Yeah, so the middle, yeah. And once you get a lot of people, living in one place, and they're stationary, they're not moving around for work, they're not transient, they're working these careers where some of these people are staying there, 10, 20, 30 years. You're building roots. You're buying a house. You have a basement perhaps where the kids can get together, start a band, get in there and play music. And anybody that has kids, doesn't matter if you're in Dayton or wherever you live, you're hoping to have something constructive for them to do, keep them out of trouble, keep them focused, keep them entertained, but on the right track. And a lot of times music is one of those options, And so it grew and fostered here, I think.
Speaking of speaking of culture and what you've been saying about how Dayton is kind of a melting pot of all these different musical cultures. Since being here, what have you noticed about the city, and how would you describe the city of Dayton's, culture?
Well, I mean, it's really amazing the amount of creativity in this town. And, it started back when it was kind of the cradle of invention, where, the electric starter for the car was invented here. The step ladder, the powered flight, it goes on and on. There's so many inventions here. The pop-top can, and some people use their creativity for that kind of things. Other people are using it for more artistic endeavors. So it's kind of that same mindset, but people are they're painting, they're creating sculpture. There's a lot of, visual artists in this town that people don't really realize. It's just always been a town where there's a lot of creativity. Again, there's the universities, University of Dayton, there's Sinclair, there's Wright State. So you have educated people coming in that want to sometimes pursue creative means, whether it's writing or performing. And Dayton has just always been a hub of that. We've had ballet forever here. One of the first ballet companies in the whole country started in Dayton. We've had the Philharmonic here for forever now too. It's just been a place that recognizes the importance of the arts and supports it. And even though the funk musicians weren't playing classical music, there's no doubt you're influenced by everything around you, and they're exposed to classical music, even if they're not going to the Philharmonic. You're hearing this stuff around you, and that Dayton is a town where these things are happening. And so, like I mentioned before, the bluegrass was going on in the 50s and 60s, and this was kind of an innovative place where guys were working jobs in the day and they were playing bluegrass music at night. And the same with these guys that were playing jazz and R&B before even, funk began. They didn't all make a living playing this music at first. They were all guys working jobs, trying to find a way to express themselves artistically, and forming bands or playing solo or just getting together and having jam sessions, and it all feeds into it. And there was also, a lot of music education in the schools in Dayton at the time too, which almost all of the funk musicians cite as a big influence on them. The ones that went to Roosevelt and Roth and schools like that, they were in the marching band, they were in the concert band and things like that. So you had these guys learning to play saxophone, trumpet, trombone, which are all big parts of funk music, is the horn section. And without that experience in the school bands, you're not really going to have a chance to learn that stuff. There's not a lot of middle school kids getting together to learn saxophone on their own, especially at the time. You have to build it in the schools, and that's where these guys all started. And then it kind of sprung out. They were playing talent shows and different things as R&B bands. Sometimes they were instrumental groups, backing vocal groups, and there would be combinations of things like London Fog and the Continentals in the late 60s, kind of before the funk explosion, which was like a white group of like rock band and then 3 to 4 African-American singers. And they would come together and do a lot of stuff, and they were one of the first mixed race groups in the area. And so they were bringing horns in, keyboards in, and things like that. And they were all people had met either through school or through sports or through playing music together, and it just kind of spins out, there was a lot of people in Ohio, players and some of these other bands that kind of cross-pollinated, were in different bands together before being part of these like famous, funk bands. There's a lot of incubation period that goes on leading up to the Ohio. Even the Ohio players, were the untouchables from like the 1950s up until the mid 60s. And Robert Ward was like the main guy at that time, and he was a guitarist. And once he left the band, the rest of the guys brought in Sugar Bonner, another guy from the South who had moved up, and formed the Ohio Players. And even then, they were kind of an R&B band. Funk wasn't really a thing yet. Funk really, 1967 is really when, funk began. Cold Sweat from James Brown is what really a lot of people considered the first funk song. And so it was pretty quick succession after that. The Ohio Players' first album came out in '69. Sly and the Family Stone released their first album in '68. It was more psychedelic soul than funk, but they progressed into that area too. Parliament Funkadelic, George Clinton was kind of starting at the same time. So there was definitely something in the water that was happening. And it wasn't just in Dayton. It was happening everywhere. And it was because, black culture was entering the mainstream at that time. In the late 60s, there was a show called Julia that was like the first sitcom to star an African-American actress. And so Sidney Poitier is making movies at that time, the first black Hollywood's leading man, and he won an Academy Award not long after that. And Flip Wilson had his show, in the early 70s, and that was a comedy show, but it was hip, whatever. It was part of this kind of the rising of black culture nationally, and everybody was feeding off that. The Ohio Players here were influenced by everything that was going on there, and that's not even to mention, the blaxploitation films that are about to start popping off right after that as well. And so it was just, it was a really exciting time, and musicians from around the world were looking toward James Brown and people like that were doing this kind of music and seeing that it was an exciting kind of thing. Fela Kuti in Africa, was influenced by James Brown, and you don't get Afropop without that. And, and that influences things all over, the world as well. So it's just never stopped, kind of growing and feeding off each other, since then. It's all just a stew of stuff, right? R&B comes from blues, gospel, folk, and jazz, and then funk just kind of turned the level up on that a little bit with a little bit more psychedelic rock in there, and an emphasis on black culture, and that's really what funk is. And the Ohio Players were right at the forefront of that. Their first record, Observations of Time, was more R&B, but once they signed to Westbound, they did a string of records, Pain, Pleasure, Ecstasy, and those are kind of the beginnings of what they did and the start of Dayton Funk. And from the covers to the music, they had the look down. They had striking visuals on the covers. Those first couple had kind of sensualized covers, but very evocative and caught people's attention and ushered in this new era of Dayton music. And the Ohio Players opened the floodgates. So many groups came in their wake, and they were very supportive of other bands. They co-signed other bands. They helped them get record deals. Members worked with other groups and helped them record, get started, book shows, played gigs with them. Without the Ohio Players, it never would have expanded like it did. And unlike a lot of groups, they stayed here in Dayton, which is very significant. They could have easily gone to California, like so many groups did, or gone to LA, or gone to Europe, or wherever. But they stayed here. They invested in this community, made it their home, and they'd tour the world. They'd play on Soul Train. They would, hit the top of the charts. But when the tour was done, they'd come back to Dayton. You'd see them driving their cars around town. You'd see them interacting with people. They'd go to church. They would be part of the community. And people saw that. It was a model for other Dayton musicians that they knew with the right amount of work, the right amount of talent, and the right amount of drive, that could be replicated. And, so many groups did. Heatwave did. They actually were in Europe. They started playing here, but Johnny and Keith Wilder formed the group in Europe, and they had one of the guys was from Spain, one of the guys was from Czechoslovakia, the drummer, I think. So they were kind of an international group. Rod Templeton was from, I think, the West Coast. But they still brought kind of that Dayton spirit to what they were doing, and Heatwave was, one of the biggest groups to come out of this whole like scene. Had big hits, and took that funk sound, globally as well. They were big in Europe, so they were taking funk to England, to Paris, and places like that before the Ohio Players were, really. So it was significant to take this music globally, and it all had kind of that Dayton sound, even though none of the groups sounded exactly the same. They each kind of had their own little flavor.
You mentioned the Dayton sound, and that is one of my questions. I do want to talk about this. How would you define the Dayton sound? What is the Dayton sound in regards to funk music?
Well, like I said, every group is a little different, but starting with the Ohio Players, it's tough, it's kind of street smart, it's got a little bit of grit to it. It's definitely heavy on the blues. They're dance grooves, but they weren't a dance group per se. They weren't like a disco group. They were danceable grooves, and they were an R&B band for sure. But they had a power, and just kind of, again, leaning on that black culture thing too of the moment, kind of that rising black power, black pride, that James Brown and other acts were pushing. So that was all emblematic of what all the groups were doing. And so, then you have groups like Lakeside and Phaso, and there were a lot of keyboards, was very important to it, like this new synthesizers everybody were using, like Moogs and ARPs and some of these new brands that were pretty new on the scene, and those kind of helped define the sound, mixed with like a big emphasis on the brass. And all these early groups, Sun, Slave, all had the big brass sections. That was a big part of it. And that's coming off what James Brown was doing before. And one of the things about James Brown, too, is he was signed to King Records out of Cincinnati. So from 56 to like early 70s, all the classic records he were doing were released in Cincinnati. And some of the stuff he was recording at King Studios right in Cincinnati. So right down 75 is where a lot of this stuff was coming. So he was bringing his group through town early on. Groups were seeing his band, getting an opportunity to play with James Brown. And so a lot of it was modeled on his high energy, brass heavy, funky sound. It's heavy on the bass too. And one of the aspects of funk is the focus on the one, on the downbeat. It starts on the one, and that's something that George Clinton of Parliament has always preached. But it's something that James Brown did too. It's like you hit it hard on that first beat, and that sets funk apart from what you would normally do in a more laid-back R&B song. So there's extra percussion going. There's a little bit of, like I said, the jazz coming in, but there's a little bit of world ethnic African rhythms coming in too via the percussion and extra things like that, which also fed into the funk, which was a little different than kind of the standard R&B before. And that was prevalent too in a lot of the Dayton groups that were coming on at the time. And while it was a high energy sound, there were always ballads. Like you had to have the slow jams. So while there was a lot of the high energy, what you would think of as hardcore funk, there were also bring it down, get sentimental, do some love songs, and have kind of more thoughtful, sentimental ballads. And that was always a balance, and that went through all those groups. And I guess it's a hallmark of R&B for sure to have that. And they just kind of sometimes would stretch them out, sometimes to make them a little bit longer, use more of a jazz approach with some more instrumental breaks, and maybe take it outside of what would be mainstream pop, but still connected with the people. It was still very visceral music that connected with people in a real way.
Wow. Yeah. connecting with people, like with music, is so important.
Right.
And that's something that I know funk definitely did around that time. So amidst of like the peak of funk's popularity in like the early 80s, especially with numerous successful groups emerging from Dayton, what was a typical day like for a musician during that era experiencing significant success?
Well, I mean, it would depend on what they had going on, because these guys were touring all over the world. And at the time they were doing this, they were putting out about an album a year. So you're talking, it's basically tour cycle, write, record, get back out, tour again, promote the records. So it was really a nonstop thing. I mean, when they were home, a lot of times they were rehearsing, writing songs, certainly seeing their family. But I mean, it's a full-time job, even though these guys were successful, had gold records, platinum records, and made a good living. It's not like they were spending all their time, laying out on yachts and partying. And I'm sure there was a fair amount of that. I mean, they certainly enjoyed themselves. But I mean, it's hard work, and once you get there, it's not a free ride. You have to sustain that. So that means every record, you have to try to match what you did before. So really, I mean, basically they're working, whether they're writing, recording, practicing, or taking care of business somehow, or trying to promote and spread the word about the music, So, I mean, really, it never ends, And a lot of these groups are still out on the road today, I mean, the Ohio Players still perform, there's still 4 longtime members of the group holding that down and playing to big crowds all the time. They've been touring steadily for years. It's not like they're doing 8-month tours like they did back in the day. A lot of it's maybe weekend dates, but they stay busy throughout the year. They do, those funk boat cruises. They do festivals. They do, their own concerts. They, they do a variety of things, and there's still a big market for funk music, not just in America, but Japan and Europe and South America and Africa and all over. It's still a beloved music, and it's still something that people, gravitate toward. And I mean, you see these funk package tours that go around, and there'll be 3 or 4 acts from back in the day, like Ohio Players or Slave. Zapp still performs. Until a couple of years ago, I mean, Heatwave was still active too. So it's one of those things where the desire's always there, and as long as the guys are able to do it and get along enough, they'll get out and keep playing the music. So I think it's just a lifetime thing, it's all about the music, really.
Wow. So, speaking of these bands, how did bands like the Ohio Players, Heatwave, Phaso, Slave, Zapp, perceive the practice of artists from subsequent genres like hip-hop, rap, sampling their funk music? So what are your thoughts and feelings regarding the reinterpretation and reuse of their work?
Right.
In different musical
It's a touchy subject for a lot of R&B musicians, funk musicians, and they're split on it. I am a huge hip hop fan, and I'm a huge fan of sampling. I'm sad that it's no longer really feasible financially for people to do like they did back in the 90s, when you could really create some amazing stuff through sampling. And it still happens today. It's just not cheap to do it. You have to have, because you have to pay, to use these samples, and rightfully so. But in the early days of hip hop, I mean, most of the funk musicians weren't too happy about it. Not only were they taking their gigs because they've got guys showing up with 2 turntables and a microphone, as they say, and putting on a show, and they're like 9, 10, 12-piece bands touring around with a horn section, a percussionist, guitar, keys, all this stuff, and it's a big production. They've got costume changes, they've got the whole shebang, they've got a road crew, and then you've got these guys that can come in, undercut you on the price, and do these gigs very easily. That's very appealing to promoters because while they're about the music, they're also about the money. And if they can pack a house with a couple guys and pay them $5,000 as opposed to paying $30,000 or $100,000, whatever it is, for a big band, they're going to go for that every time. So they were a little salty about that. And then they're sampling these songs. And in the early days, there was no clear-cut rules on how to sample and what that meant. And the earliest songs not really were samples. They were more interpolations, and they were using big hunks of songs to base the whole thing on. Like Rapper's Delight was based on a song by Chic, and it's a band performing it, just kind of redoing kind of a version of this groove from Chic. And Nile Rodgers ended up suing him for that, and he got a co-writing credit for it, and rightfully so again. So that kind of started the conversation of what does this mean to, because it's one thing if you're in the park and you're spinning records and you're mixing things up and nobody's getting paid other than a couple, whatever. Nobody cares. But when you're making records and it's on the charts and there's royalties to be made, people want a cut of it. And a lot of the musicians didn't like the fact that these guys were using parts of their songs and getting famous by doing it, and they didn't see the artistry of it, which I disagree with. I think it takes a lot of artistry to be able to use a sample correctly. People did do it incorrectly, and there's many of examples of that. But done the right way, it can be pretty amazing. And I think, George Clinton and people like that soon understood it. I mean, George Clinton has been sampled, from Parliament Funkadelic so many times, and he gets paid for it. So he early on learned to embrace that stuff and realize that not only is he making money off it, but it's introducing his music to a whole generation of people who don't know Parliament Funkadelic, but they hear these keyboard parts, they hear these vocal samples, and they might hear the song and start putting pieces together or want to, just trace it back and find out where it comes from. But it keeps the music alive, and it certainly has kept funk music alive for many people, and I don't think without the rise of hip-hop, it would be as strong as it is today, and they've all learned to accept it at this point, because, hip-hop is one of the most influential, if not the most influential music in the world. It has influenced every country, every aspect of, the whole globe, and still does to this day, and the biggest music in the world is still somehow, draws from hip-hop and R&B and those influences. But again, they're just building on, funk like those guys did before. And that's the great thing about music. As long as people keep mixing things up and finding new ways to approach what already exists, new forms rise. There's only so many notes in the, in the scale, and there's only so many instruments, but the mind is an amazing thing. And if you can find ways to mix those things up and change them and bring fresh approaches to it, you got whole new ways of approaching music, and we see it around us all the time. It still happens to this day. Even though I think hip hop was probably the last major musical innovation we've seen, everything else I think has been somehow spun out of that or something that already existed. Electronic music is certainly big now, but electronic music existed in the 50s, it's has been building as well. So it's I really, everything is a version of that's out there now. It's all some form of dance music or classical or country or folk, but it's all there. So I don't know where we go, but we keep spinning it and making music. So
yeah, that's the cool thing about music, though. You never know what you're gonna get.
You don't know.
You don't know where the future's gonna take you. I guess sort of shifting
Yeah.
gears. So you moved to Dayton far after, race riots.
Yes.
But however, Dayton is still considered one of the most segregated cities in the country. Realizing that funk was created out of a time of social unrest and injustice, how do the arts and music give individuals, as well as a community, the opportunity to express themselves?
Well, the arts give you, that's the thing about the arts, right? Is you can put anything you want into it. There are no restrictions. You can talk about anything you want, whether it's social injustice, whether it's heartbreak, whether it's the fact that you're mad at your mom. You can do whatever you want. And, the musicians in this town that were making music, especially the funk music, they grew up in a town where the schools were getting integrated and when there was still a lot of problems going on. But sports and music were two of the things that kind of drew people together. People in high schools, people in neighborhoods. Like East Dayton was a heavy Appalachian neighborhood, like the 3rd Street area, but it was blacks and whites alike, and they all grew up together. They were living next door to each other. They were going to school together. So they were already finding ways to work together, and they realized that sports, athletics, arts can be a bridge where it doesn't matter what color you are. It doesn't matter really anything except whether you want to get involved and share a part of yourself with these people. And again, it's about connecting, but you get together, especially in a band situation, and you throw all these ideas together, and even if there's a leader, it's still the sum of everybody's parts. So all these people are working through all these ideas, and they're discussing these things, whether it's the problems they had getting to practice that day, whether it's the person who gave them a hard time on the bus, or whatever it is. And you put that into the music, you put that into the art, and if you don't express it, it could eat you up. It's not healthy. So music is a way it enlivens the soul. It relieves the pressure of the bad things going on, or at least it has that potential, especially if you embrace it wholeheartedly and put yourself into it. So there's always a need for that kind of stuff. And it definitely was happening in the early 70s into the mid 70s and early 80s. As the music grew, and I don't know.
Thank you. So you were in a band around these times. So what was it like creating music in a city where there was so much, music and live creativity?
Well, it's great. I've always said Dayton's a city of musical enablers. If you want to play music, there's certainly people around that will, and you can do it, that will say, let's do it. Let's go. And it's always been a thing. Like I started off in like the punk rock scene. So up until like the late 70s, other than the funk scene, there wasn't a lot of original music going on in Dayton. The covers were big. In the 60s, there were like 1,000 rock bands, supposedly, but they were almost all playing covers. They would do some originals, and they put out some singles and things like that. But there weren't a lot of rock bands making albums in Dayton. The funk thing was a total anomaly. Like there were bluegrass groups making records, there were some country groups doing it, but there wasn't a lot of rock stuff happening until punk hit Dayton. Punk rock started 75, 76, didn't get to the Midwest, Chicago, Dayton, Indianapolis, places like that, till like 78, 79, really. And that's the first bands in Dayton for the punk scene were like Toxic Reasons, Dementia Precox, 1979, and that ushered in like a whole original rock scene in Dayton that's still going on today, but it didn't exist until that point. So I started playing in '82, so I came in just at the very beginning of that stuff. I played in a band called The New Creatures, and we played the clubs in town. We put out cassettes, a single, did an album. We did the grassroots tour where you book it yourself and you get in the van and you drive down to Nashville and Atlanta and Boston and do all these things. And it's not glamorous, but it's fun, and it gets you out of town, and you're playing music for people and you're meeting people, and it's addictive. And all this time later, I still play in a band. I've been playing in a band called Smug Brothers since 2008. We just played in Pittsburgh and Columbus a couple weeks ago. You know, it's I don't get out as much as I do, but it's still great to get out and share music with people and connect with people and play with friends, bands, and do all that. And yeah, it's crazy.
That's wonderful. You just, like, still, you know, make music. I mean, it's just, yeah, it's a gift.
It's when it's in you, you know, it's in you. And now, even though there's no groups really like doing what Ohio Players, Phaso, Zap, any of those guys did, there's more original music going on in Dayton now than ever before. I mean, I've been covering music now for 28 years locally, and I can tell you there's more great music happening now than ever. It's, because it's easier to make now than ever before because of the emergence of digital technology. There's great studios in town still, you know, 6 or 7 really, that where you can go and pay a high-tech studio guy to help you make a record, but you don't have to do that. With a laptop and the right software and some creativity, you could do that, and people do. You know, so there's it's just going on. There's a lot of great rap going on. There's R&B, country, rock, electronic music. I mean, it's across the board. There's jazz. You know, there's just a little bit of everything going on. The problem is it's just none of it's hugely mainstream or even locally mainstream. You know, it's all niche at this point. You know, almost anything that's not super mainstream is a subculture, really. You know, jazz is a subculture. Indie rock is a subculture, you know, even though it's huge, even EDM is still, you know, it's a subculture, and not as big as it would have been in the 90s when everything wasn't so bifurcated and everything, there was more a monoculture. You know, we're far from that now, where it doesn't matter what you're into, you can fixate on that. You know, like I'm really into like Japanese pop and electronic music, especially from like the 70s and 80s. And so, I mean, you can obsess over that now in the digital world with Spotify and YouTube and stuff like that. But none of it, but nobody knows. Like, there are fans of all this music, but like people aren't huge fans of Japanese pop music mainstream. You know what I mean? It's not one of those things that's ever going to go wide, but that doesn't take away the joy of it or the beauty of it or the power of it. So that's the thing, you know, nothing will ever have that kind of cultural impact like the funk did in the day. There's Taylor Swift, who has a cultural impact, but she's a force of one. You know, there aren't a lot of people out there today that do that. But in the 70s and 80s, there wasn't as many options. So the radio, if you had a radio hit, almost everybody knew it. You know, that's how like a kid like me knew Boogie Nights by Heatwave, because it was a hit everywhere, you know, not just in Dayton. It was a hit all across the country, all across the world. Doesn't happen quite so much anymore with some of these smaller groups. Even, I don't even know, you know, even today Prince might have trouble like selling as many records as he did have it, you know, toward the end. Just people don't push the units as they, you know, as they say, as people once did, because everybody has their thing. But it's out there. It's out there. You just have to look for it.
You know, that's the cool thing about Spotify and stuff. Like, I love searching up songs on Spotify and getting to know other genres. But that brings me to, like, what you were saying about funk was mainstream, but now it's maybe not. So funk had its run,
Mhm.
it's no longer what it was.
Right.
So, in simple terms, what do you think it was that, ultimately killed funk?
Well, I mean, disco didn't help. When disco came in, it put a dent in some of that for groups. Again, it was one of those things where it was a DJ coming in and playing disco records for dancers, so there wasn't even a band involved. Sometimes they would bring a drummer in. Some of these clubs would have a drummer that would play behind the beat, but they wouldn't have like full bands. So again, it was a way to spread this music, and so they weren't getting the gigs they were before. But there were still, Roger Troutman and Zapp, they didn't really break until after disco was the thing. They didn't really break until the early 80s. So they were able to kind of take the more synthesized, heavy stuff that was happening in Japan and Europe and places like that and kind of take funk in a new era, which is what Zapp did. They didn't have the big horn section. They did the horn parts on the keyboards. Which again was a cost-saving thing for them. They didn't have to have a big horn section. You didn't have to bring along 3 or 4 extra guys that had to have a per diem, had to have a hotel room, had to have a space in the bus. Suddenly, a smaller van can maybe work, and you can take a band like Zapp out with 6 people instead of 8, 9, 12. And so they were able to make that work, but the finances just didn't work for some of these bigger bands. It just again priced out. It wasn't that they weren't making good music. They still made records, but if you're not getting out, and especially if those days, if you weren't getting out and touring and taking music to the people, you're not in their presence as much. That's how you get famous. You can make records, but unless you were on the road, hardly anybody's getting famous. You know what I mean? That's what it takes, is taking the music to the people and making fans night after night, playing those songs, making those connections, going back to those towns and enforcing those connections. And once that stops happening, there's diminishing returns. You don't have as many people looking for your records. You don't have as many people at the radio stations paying attention, wanting to play those songs. So it just kind of fell out of the mainstream. Which things do. Nothing has a run forever. Something new is always going to come and usurp it. And that's what happened after disco, the rise of rap, and R&B, again, had a big rise, which built on the funk, but was a little bit different. So there was a kind of a new generation of funk with Prince and The Time and groups like that were coming out, and Janet Jackson and things like that were building on funk, but taking it into a new, maybe poppier, different realm. And so the sounds changed. And a lot of that, again, was drum machines, these synthesizers, and synthesizers are getting smaller all the time through the 80s, getting less expensive, getting better technically. And so they were able to just grow and change the sound. So when sounds evolve, that old sound just doesn't work. And none of those groups, like Ohio Players, weren't going to trade in a horn section and get a bunch of keyboard guys. I mean, even though they had keyboards and it was a big part of the sound, it wasn't the anchor like it was for Zapp and some of these other groups that came out in the 80s, because they just didn't have them. The keyboard technology wasn't there until the late 70s, early 80s, so like that. So yeah, I mean, it was really, I think, disco and then hip hop and R&B just usurped it. But, it never went away, and you still see songs by Ohio Players, Lakeside, used in commercials. They're used in TV shows, in films. So they have never gone away. They're just become part of the culture. And, you just see them coming back. And so I don't think there's a way they'll ever die. There'll be new movies, there'll be new shows or commercials or something that's going to want to use an Ohio Players song. It's going to want to use a song by Heatwave or somebody. And brings it back around. And I mean, I know even today I hear a song in a commercial that I've never heard before, and I'm like, oh, what is that? And I'll look for it. And, you know, people can say whatever they want about the commercialization of music and selling out your songs to be in a commercial, but, you know, being a musician is about making a living, and you can't just make a living for the 6 to 10 to 15, 20 years you're quote unquote relevant. You know, when the big money's coming in, you have to be able to pay the bills for the long haul. And if you can put it in a commercial and you get a nice check that helps you live till, you know, the next check comes, there's nothing wrong with that, you know, especially if it's done tastefully. So, yeah.
Exactly. If it's done tastefully, I agree.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned those ways of it being revitalized, but what other ways do you see funk being revitalized within, maybe even within like our Dayton culture, or I guess just the arts in general being revitalized in Dayton?
Well, you know, I mean, it seems like it's an ongoing thing in Dayton. It's always a struggle to have public arts, have public performances, have, you know, real culture. Groups come and go, but we've always had something going on, and a group of people always interested in pushing forward and bringing the music and arts to the people. I don't know. I lost my train of thought. What were we talking about again?
It's okay. How are the arts being revitalized in Dayton today?
Oh, yeah. How are they? Jeez, I wish I knew. The only thing that can keep the arts revitalized is really artists, public, and the infrastructure to support it. And we do have that in Dayton, especially, like I said, with the performing arts, the fine arts, and there are venues for that. And then also for kind of rising talent. You have things like the Levitt, which is a newer addition to downtown Dayton, which only does original music. There are plenty of venues that will do cover songs and cover acts and tribute acts and things like that. But with the Levitt, it's all original. I think you could play maybe one cover or something. It's like very limited on what you can do. They have a focus on originality, and they're dedicated to a lot of different things, but variety, bringing in a lot of different music, but including people from all over the region of all socioeconomic levels, of all races, of all creeds. You know, they just want to have a meeting place where people can come and enjoy music. It's free, and they have a lot of traveling national, international acts, but they always have local stuff, and there's a big focus on that, and they always make sure that's a part of it. And that's been a big thing in the last few years of helping introduce the new generation of original talent that's creating new music to these audiences in the suburbs and in Dayton that don't necessarily go to the clubs and other venues where most of the original music is happening these days, that are kind of the incubators for the new sounds and what people are doing. So it gives these groups a chance to showcase for free on a big stage with a great sound system in a legit, respected venue. And so that, in a way, has helped legitimize a lot of people in this area that to a group of people that didn't even know they existed really until they started doing it regularly. Because like I said, they're not going to Yellow Cab Tavern or Blind Bob's to see original music. They're not going to the Bright Side all the time. Maybe some of them are, but it's a great way, free, early shows. Like they start at 7:30, you know, and they do them Thursday, Friday, Saturday, all through the summer. So people know that they can go and see good talent, even if you don't know the out-of-town acts or the local acts. You know they're good because they've been vetted, and the Levitt has kind of built their reputation on having quality acts. So if you go there, you're not going to be disappointed. So that's been huge. And it's still too early to see what impact that's going to have. But it's important it's happening now, because with so many people moving downtown and with new living spaces being built all the time, there needs to be more things for them to do. And the fact that there are groups now focused on original arts, visual arts, music, performing arts, plays, whatever it is going on in town, it helps showcase that, and it helps these people make a living and reach new people. And so in 10 years, I'm excited to see really where Dayton's going to be creatively. I'm excited to see where Dayton will be creatively, because it is growing. I mean, it's all based on finances, the economy, how are things going to be, in the country over the next 10 years. But all things going well, I mean, it could be a very exciting time in Dayton, because there's a group of people in power booking shows and in the city that realize there's an importance to showcasing local talent and bringing it to the people. So that's one way. Also, the National Funk Museum and Exhibition Center, which will be opening up in Troy and has been an ongoing endeavor, is another way that's going to really cement, Dayton's legacy for Dayton funk, because there will be a museum with showcasing instruments, costumes, anything to album art, anything to do with funk music, but also they'll have live music, they'll have classes, they'll have seminars, they'll have all manner of different programming to showcase the importance of Dayton funk and what it has meant, not just to the Dayton area, but what it's meant to the United States and to the world at large. Like I said, there are music fans all over the world that love the Ohio Players, that love Heatwave, that love Phaso and Lakeside and all these groups. And they will make the trip to Dayton I said Troy, it's Trotwood, where they'll be doing that, Trotwood, for the Funk Museum. So that's only going to help enrich, the history of the funk music, but also Dayton's part in it. And so it'll be nice. They had a short-lived spot down on West 3rd Street, but they had to move from there in 2019, and it was nice. They had people coming from outside the United States to visit the exhibits they had up. So, I mean, it will be a spot, a destination spot when it opens up in Trotwood. It's going to be a couple years, but I know the state of Ohio has allotted, some millions of dollars to help make this thing a reality. So it will happen, but those things never happen fast. So it could be a matter of years still. But it will be, then it'll be a cornerstone of Dayton area in the Miami Valley and what it means to have funk here and showcase it for the next generations of people and hopefully inspire more people to take up that music. I mean, there are still groups today playing variations of funk, plenty of horn bands out there mixing jazz and R&B and electronic music and dance music and creating new generations of funk. So this, I think, will only help that and help point other people in that direction. So we might see a new wave in 5-10 years. You never know. Maybe sooner.
Maybe sooner. That would be really cool.
Yeah.
That. As a community, how can we celebrate creativity? I know we kind of touched on this with, starting music back up and teaching it, but.
Well, I mean, I think the best way to celebrate it is to first embrace it and go out to shows, buy the music, stream the music, but and more importantly, be an enthusiastic supporter of it. Share it with people, promote it, tell your friends about it, tell your neighbors about it. I mean, there's plenty to love about the Ohio Players. You just have to give it a chance. It still impacts people. I told you the story about the archaeologists who discovered the fossil that they named after the Ohio Players song, Funky Worm. And this was just last year out in the Petrified Forest National Park. Petrified Forest National Park, yeah. And they discovered a fossil, and they named it the Funky Worm. And they're working in like a very microscopic area. So it's not giant dinosaur bones, but it's the first time something like that has happened. And these people, young guy, like in their, I guess, 20s, early 30s, digging in the dirt. It's because it's very, in there, and they're blasting playlists on Spotify that's got Ohio Players and Zap, Heatwave, Parliament Funkadelic, and all this stuff, and it's helping them get through the day. And they were so inspired when they found it that they decided to name it after an Ohio Players song. And so that's pretty exciting. And I know that they discovered another one that they'll be naming after a Parliament Funkadelic song. I'm not sure what that'll be, what the song is, or what the discovery was, but you just never know how it can impact people and culture. And so there's all kind of, archaeologists and scientists listening to who knows what while they're doing their work,
It's a wonderful thing. In times of hardship, people will turn to the arts as an emotional release. So how have you seen music help the city of Dayton heal? Because, we've had tragedies here before. So how have you seen it heal?
Well, just bringing people together. I think a good example of that, when Ohio Players were at the Levitt Pavilion in 2021, was the first time they'd been there, and it was like the season closing concert, and it was packed. There were people from all over the city. There were people from the suburbs, black, white, brown, young, old, of probably 4 generations of people. And you don't see that every day and in every culture or every situation. So I think the biggest way to heal is just to bring people together and show that despite the differences, that we have more similarities. We're all the same. We're all trying to get through life, take care of our family, take care of our homes, take care of ourselves, and hopefully leave a positive imprint on the planet and not mess things up too bad. And no better way to do that if you're shaking your butt and smiling to some great music. And, I can't tell you how many times I've been to a concert and you're dancing and grooving to the music and you look over to somebody that you don't know and you smile and you have this moment of recognition that life doesn't get much better than this. We're all in this together, and as long as we can keep that attitude, life is good and we can persevere. And I think the more we're together and we can commune together and share the music and share experiences, the better off we'll be. During the pandemic was kind of a dark time when people couldn't get together in large groups. Some people don't mind that, but for some people it feeds your soul to be in a group of people experiencing euphoria, pleasure, a good time. And even if you don't, it still can do that for you, especially if you're in a group of people and they're singing all at the top of their voices, all the words they know, and it doesn't get any better than that, really.
I agree full-heartedly. Music heals.
It does.
It really does.
It does.
So, we have just a couple more questions. But why is it important to preserve something like funk music in Dayton?
Well, for one, it's great music and should be, just for the permanent record, it should be here forever. But we should keep sharing it just because it's good. It's just important to keep this stuff alive. You don't want any music to die. There's a reason that orchestras still perform classical music from the 1700s, the 1600s, before that. This music is important to people, and you can still learn new things hearing a song that's 100, 200 years old then, you know, you can't hear a brand new song. So, I mean, we have to keep this stuff alive. It's certainly important, but for Dayton people, it's also important to keep this music alive as a model for what you can do. Just because you live in a city like Dayton and it's not New York, it's not LA, it's not Chicago, doesn't mean that you can't get out and make music, do something that can impact the bigger world, that can have an impact beyond your community. It can be done. You just have to put in the work and the time, and I'm sure you got to have the breaks, but it's still doable. Anybody can pursue that, and I think you should always be reminded of that. You can't have too many examples of that out there, and so I think future generations need to know that, like the Wright brothers created powered flight, funk was booming here in the 70s and 80s, and it was making money. It was bringing money into the Dayton economy. It was taking culture around the world, and it was making people dance. And so that's all important stuff.
That's true. That is true. I love when music can do that. Well, this might be a simple question, but now that we have talked a lot about funk and music here in Dayton, where does music come from?
I mean, you know, I wish I really knew where it came from. I mean, it comes from musicians, obviously. They put in the work, and you have to rehearse. There's a lot of things that go into it. But really, I mean, it seems to just come from the ether. I mean, I've read countless interviews with musicians that say they don't write their songs, that they come to them. They're a gift from God or wherever, from some omnipotent place, that it's really hard to pin it down. I mean, I'm amazed that with as many songs that are out there, that anybody can make up a song, because hasn't it already been done? But people do it all the time. I've been playing in bands, like I said, since '82, and I don't know, I've played on 30-something albums, played on countless songs. I wish I knew where they came from, you know? People sit down and write them, but it's a magical thing, and it never ceases to be magical. And it never, I mean, sometimes the well goes dry, and then sometimes it becomes plentiful. But when you can get in a room with people and sit down at your instruments and create something on the spot, I mean, where does it come from? It's a collective mind, because you've got 3 or 4 more people doing it, but it happens, you know. It's just magic. I mean, I don't know if magic exists, that's what it is, because it's beyond human comprehension, I think. Because if we could nail it down, everybody would be doing it that wanted to do it. And not everybody can write a song, but some people have the ability to tap into that divine inspiration and put it out to people and share it with them in a way that is not only palatable, but engaging and sometimes addictive, and you want more of it, you know. So the word, I guess, is catchy, but yeah, it's magic. That's my answer. It's magic.